Hello, everyone. We are here at Here Art Center with James Godwin, who's currently doing Flatiron Hex. Thank you for joining us, James. Can you tell us a little bit about what the show's about?
I can. It's about a gentleman who, in our world, would probably be working in computers and IT, but in this world, he uses shamanic techniques to service the computers of the city known as New York, which is a future version of New York City. During a certain operation, he makes a big mistake and gets into a lot of trouble, and he ends up having to redeem himself in order to save the town, New York, from a catastrophic superstorm.
You've done this show in the past, so why was 2017 the right time to bring it back?
Well, all the stars aligned, basically, and an opening was here, and that just sort of happened. You know, the door opened and we took it. And we've been trying for a while to remount the show in a couple of different ways, and this one presented itself, and like I said, we just went for it.
I'm really curious about, because I've seen images and I've seen video of the main character, Wiley, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about where the inspiration to create Wiley and where his name came from as well?
Oh, yeah. The main character's name is Wiley Walker, and he, like I said, he's a shaman who works for the city. And the character came from an inspiration from a book called Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban. It's from like the 1980s or so. I urge you to read it. It's post-apocalyptic, before that was so fashionable. And it's written in what's kind of like a phonetic Old English, pidgin broken English. You have to, as you read it, you start to figure out how they're speaking, because in the first book there was no glossary, no dictionary, no anything. So you kind of had to figure out by cross-referencing what certain words meant as you went along with the text. And the main character was named Ridley Walker, and he had psychic powers. And part of the book is that their religion was these two men that would go from tribe to tribe doing a Punch and Judy show, and then they would go into a psychic trance and tell the people of the tribes what was happening in between the tribes. And one tribe was starting to make gunpowder, and there's lots of crazy, surreal intrigue in it. So that was one inspiration. Wiley being somebody that I met whose name was Wiley, and then Wiley Coyote being a trickster, of course, and just the way the Wiley is such a nice sounding name. So phonetically, it's fun.
Right. So from the title, it's clear that New York architecture is an essential part of your show. So what was the biggest challenge in, creating a version of New York for stage?
That would be because we don't want to illustrate too much, because we're at very low-tech means. So a lot of the world building that we do is auditory, but supported by certain very well-chosen images and puppets. For instance, I think the only time you ever see the Flatiron building is in a shadow puppet representation, which is two-dimensional, very flat black shadow. So we really just try to evoke the feeling of the architecture, and since it's such an iconic building, we don't have to work that hard for people to know what we're talking about, right? Because the Flatiron is very iconic. People can see it in their heads. We don't have to do too much to illustrate that. It was always been an image that I've wanted to work with, and when we were putting together the components of the show, myself and the co-writer, Tom Burnett, we wanted there to be a special property in the Flatiron building where if you opened the windows in the top 3 floors in a certain pattern, when the superstorm would be approaching the city, the wind would blow through those windows and it would make an Aeolian harp. So the music would blow through, it would make a tone, and that tone would dissipate the storm, but you had to get the right combination of windows. So that's part of what Wiley was working on when he screws up, and then they can't figure out how to get the windows right. So.
Oh wow, that sounds really wonderful. I'm imagining it now. So part of the show, like you mentioned, is includes audience members engaging their imagination. They can just wander somewhere else. So why is it important for you to activate, I guess, this part of people's brains?
It's mostly because of what puppetry does best. If you keep things pretty simple and you animate things in a very precise way, but you can be messy too, but the more precise you can be, the more direct you can be. You don't need a lot of bells and whistles like blinking eyes and wiggling ears and all that kind of animation. the very precise low tech tends to engage people's imaginations, and I've talked to people afterwards where they think that puppets are blinking their eyes and things are happening that aren't happening. So that to me is a good level of feedback in that people are seeing things and I'm getting their imagination engaged in such a way that puppets do really well. That and using scale shifts and certain types of techniques, distancing myself, certain magical techniques too that are just really mechanics, things of that nature. And practice, so people would never think that you have to practice something a lot. That's what stage magic is mostly. You practice a very precise way to hide something in your hand over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So that's part of what we do here in this show too. So that's really fun to have the illusions go through that seem really simple but take a good amount of work behind them.
I read that the Flatiron Hex was the first part of a trilogy, and I wondered if the trilogy is still happening. And if the 2 next chapters are going to be named after other New York landmarks as well.
Well, the material for the other 2 is definitely there in the stuff that we cut from the first one. We built the world. We had a list of characters. We had people that are characters, things, situations that we wanted, and we chose from that world that we built. And in the show now, there are characters who are named who you never quite really see. They have impact on the action. There are certain ways characters interact and change into other characters that's kind of interesting and weird. And so the other 2 haven't been written yet, but the material is there. I think every one of them will be based around the Flatiron. We have a very specific map of the world that it's in, and the Flatiron will have other things that it does besides just being a storm detector and destroyer. So I'd like it to be sort of like, the TARDIS in Doctor Who or something like that. It's a very central image to it. And it's just really an anchor to the world. We could open it up to other buildings, leave all the options open, but it's definitely the central focal point of the world. So it'll probably be in all of them.
When you first decided that you wanted to become a puppeteer, what was the one thing that blew your mind the most about the art of puppeteering?
I was always a Muppet fan, that's for sure. And that was just kind of in my blood. I never really thought about it. I was more going towards performance art and sort of the dark, weird Lower East Side of New York in the 80s, early 90s performance artwork. So I was doing a lot of mask things and sort of like, at the time they were calling it alternative comedy. So there were a lot of clubs you could do that in. And I went to go see my friend's, he was working on a Bill Baird show that was up on on Broadway. And I saw Alice in Wonderland, which was fine. But I didn't know that they did a little variety show afterwards, and they showed you different vignettes. And one of the vignettes were these dancing rope stick figure people who were dancing, and that blew my mind. The illusion of the full bodies dancing looked completely real, and I'd never seen that before. So I went, my friend was working backstage, so I went backstage, and I was like prepared to see all this crazy stuff making it happen, and it was just ropes with handles attached and just people moving them. There was nothing magical or special or anything like that, and that blew my mind again. So that got me thinking about making something that I could puppeteer, because there wasn't anybody really doing that in the downtown scene at the time. There weren't any puppet slams. There weren't anybody doing that. And you usually went and saw, the Henson Festival or something like that, and you saw a marionette, big production or something. So I started to get really interested in bunraku, American tabletop, and started working with a couple of people, and we formed a company, and we did a lot of shows downtown in downtown clubs, doing puppetry in comedy clubs, things of that nature, and just kind of grew out of that because people were like, "What are you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, we're doing puppetry," but they had never seen it, so it was nice to get a lot of attention by being different.
What's the most unique or the most strange object or material that you've ever used for one of your puppets?
There's so many. There's a desk lamp in this show, but that's not really exotic. I guess human teeth, my teeth, but that's not in the show, but that's probably the most exotic.
I don't know. I don't even think I can imagine how that looks.
They just look like teeth. You wouldn't really know. It would be easier to fake it, but yeah.
And you also do workshops and teach the art of puppeteering. So what's like the first thing? No spoilers, I guess people should sign up for your class. But What's like the one of the first things that you teach your new students?
Well, when I teach at School of Visual Arts, we usually start with just design concepts. That's really important to me before we even get into the more esoteric forms. So we usually start with a hand puppet and 3D sculpting with your hands with actual materials, which is kind of rare these days. So that's usually where we start. People getting used to using the materials. They can be challenged by how things act. You know, it's not the 3D model, so things are messy, things have to dry, things take time. There's no undo. I mean, there is, kind of, but it's a different thing. So we start with that, then we do a hand puppet, which usually is more complicated than people anticipate. And then we move on to a rod puppet, and we do a Czechoslovakian marionette at the end of it. I usually teach around this time, but I took the semester off to do the show.
And
I work at the Eugene O'Neill. That's more of people are already doing puppets. They're already really focused on puppetry. So usually I can get more into manipulation of tabletop as a specialty and just stagecraft in general, performance techniques, that kind of thing.
And do you have any message for our viewers before we say goodbye?
Yes, please come see the show. It's probably the weirdest, funniest, bloodiest puppet show you'll ever see.
Thank you, James, and thank you guys for watching.